Okay, welcome to webinar night here in Harvard and beyond. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Douglas Krager. I am the president of the Harvard Historical Society. Whoops, just a moment. Got this. Yes, I am president of the Harvard Historical Society. And before we get started, I just want to let you know about some upcoming programs we have in line for you. Currently, we have a concert series. We started a new thing just this year. We have an artist in residence. His name is Gavin Klein. He is a junior at Neshoba Regional High School in Bolton, and he is a fantastic organist. And he's been performing basically once monthly. We record it and put it on our YouTube channel and on Facebook and on our website, our own website, which is harvardhistory.org. So you can go there and check out his concerts. The next one coming up might be of interest to some of you with an Irish background. As you can imagine, with St. Paddy's Day just around the corner here, he's going to do a concert with Irish music. So look for that on our website, harvardhistory.org, or on Facebook, or check out our YouTube channel. In May, we're going to be participating in Freedom's Way, Hidden Treasures. Hidden Treasures is a great program, and I could probably talk about that for an hour. But just to give you a brief synopsis of what it is, for the month of May, Freedom's Way sponsors programs in the local communities. There are 45 towns and cities, I think that number's right, in the Freedom's Way region. And during the month of May, there are over 200 programs that you can check out in each town. The Historical Society here in Harvard has participated in that for 5 years. The Alpaca Ranch in Harvard and Fruitlands in Harvard. There are some other groups in Harvard that participate as well. So check them out. Do a quick Google and check out Hidden Treasures, Freedom's Way, Hidden Treasures. What we're going to do this year is a self-guided tour of the Center Burial Grounds. You'll get a chance to meet some of the, well, actually, I'm sorry, we won't have living history characters this year, but we'll have storyboards and information about some of the residents of the Center Burial Ground. And it'll be a great opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about the Harvard residents in years past. And then in September, date is still to be announced, we'll be doing a program that we're calling a Common History Tour, which will be another self-guided tour, but this time of the Harvard Common and of the structures around the Common. A great opportunity to learn the history of the Harvard Common. It is based on a book that is being written, will be published by that time, by Carleen Phillips and her years and years and years of experience researching the Harvard Common. So it's a great opportunity. Again, that's the Common History Tour, and you'll be able to get more information on this on our website, harvardhistory.org, as well as pay attention and watch our Facebook site. And we are new to Instagram, so we are a little bit further into the 21st century, finally. Right now, I'm thrilled to introduce the speaker for this evening, Kara Fossey. Kara is the executive director of the Fort Devens Museum over in Devens, as well as director of the Groton Historic Center. She comes to us with high praise, and we are thrilled to hear her upcoming presentation. And so for now, I think what I will do is turn it over to Kara.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for having me. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Before I start, I want to talk just for a minute or two about the Fort Devens Museum itself. When Fort Devens was still an Army base, there was a museum there. It held artifacts relating to the history of Devens and the greater military history of New England. But when Fort Devens closed as an active base in 1996, that museum closed, and all the items belonging to the Army stayed within that organization and went to, individual division museums and other military institutions. So our current museum did not receive any of those items. The current Fort Devens Museum started in the year 2000 by a group of people in the area who are interested in preserving the land that was known as Camp Devens, Fort Devens, and just Devens. Over those, 20 years now, I guess, people have been wonderfully generous, sharing their stories, their photographs, and their artifacts. People will come in with items that belong to themselves or to their family. And with each of those pieces of information and those stories and those items, we're able to start piecing the history of Fort Devens back together. As far as today's talk goes, at the end of 1918, the United States was hit with what is widely known as the second wave of the Spanish influenza. The majority of my research for this presentation came from diaries and letters from soldiers that we have in our collection, and also many articles from the Boston Globe that we have filed in our archives. I've been in the history field for about 20 years now or so. And I think that this past year, more than ever, history has really become relevant in a lot of people's lives. People who may not have been super interested before are now taking note of, the literal statues of our past that have been erected, and the metaphorical construct of our society's reaction to the current health crisis. So in thinking about the epidemic of 1918 and looking at our own pandemic today, the comparison, I believe, is pretty much a textbook example of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So within days of arriving at Boston at the end of August of 1918, the Spanish influenza epidemic traveled quickly about 40 miles west of Boston to Camp Devens, where on September 8th, it began its devastation of the camp. Overcrowded with almost 45,000 soldiers at that point, 1/3 fell ill with the virus and related infections by the time that the epidemic was over. Close to 1,000 people at Devens would end up losing their lives. After the worst was over, Boston Globe reporter William J. Robinson wrote, "The whole battle to rid the camp of Spanish influenza is a story of never-ending toil, of sleepless days and nights, of heroic devotion to duty, of weary, heavy-lidded, dogged resistance against an unseen and practically unknown foe." The Great War had been going on in Europe since 1914, and the United States officially joined its allies in World War I in April of 1917. Immediately, the War Department recognized the need for a large-scale or various large-scale military training and began building cantonments around the country. Air was eventually chosen as the location for one of these camps because of the railroad that already went directly into the center of town. William J. Robinson, who I mentioned, authored a lot of the Boston Globe articles from this time, also wrote the book Forging the Sword, The Story of Camp Devens, if anyone's familiar with that. It was published around 1920 and is really an excellent resource for those beginning years of Camp Devens. So in Forging the Sword, Robinson wrote, "One spring day in 1917, a group of Army officers, together with a few civilians, drove by automobile from the headquarters of the Northeastern Department in Boston to the little railroad town of Ayer, Massachusetts. Their cars continued through the town almost to the Shirley line, where the Mohawk Trail crosses the Nashua River. They climbed to the brow of a steep hill just off the main road. Evidently, it was the spot they were seeking, for they stood there for some time, pointing off into the distance." And again, in this old postcard, you can see sort of what the area would have looked like at that time before they even started building. So Camp Devens was established in 1917 on about 5,000 acres of land that was leased from 112 landowners in the towns of Ayer, Harvard, Shirley, and Lancaster. The Fred T. Lay Company was chosen as the general contractor for this project. Enormous quantities of building supplies, as you can see here, arrived at the cantonment daily via a railroad siding that was built off the main line that went directly into the center of Air. Barracks were completed at a rate of about 10 per day. You can see them in progress here. After the framing was complete, teams of electricians, steam fitters, and plumbers would quickly go through these. And, they fitted them with amenities that some of the soldiers, especially from rural areas, didn't even have at their own home at that point. By September 1917, most of the camp was complete. You can see in these two images, it's actually the same view, but 10 weeks apart. So again, the camp was built very, very quickly, and it really dwarfed the towns around it. Some of the training ranges were not completed yet, but in early September, the first draftees began arriving for training at Devens. The YMCA had a prominent place at Camp Devens during these early years. This is one of the official camp maps from 1917. This is actually from a YMCA brochure. So all of those red spots are YMCA buildings. I believe eventually they actually had 14 buildings on Camp Devens. They had a library, reading rooms, a recreation hall, they had a theater, and of course an administration building as well. Troops lived in barracks that were designed to hold an infantry company, which would have been around 100 men. The first floor had dormitories as well as a mess hall, as you can see here. The second floor was entirely dormitory space, and the latrines would have been in separate buildings away from the barracks. Conditions were kind of rough in there. Each soldier was issued 3 wool blankets, but interestingly, the winter of 1917 through 1918 was actually one of the coldest on records at that time. So again, Camp Devens was built to train an entire infantry division, which is generally around 20,000 men. Although its peak population during World War I actually grew to almost 45,000. Many soldiers who arrived at Devens were not prepared for the winter weather. And obviously from photos like this in our collection, we can see that the weather didn't slow them down, although some of the soldiers who were not used to this kind of weather would often write home, as we see in letters, complaining that they were forced to drill outside. Some of them complained that, they're wet all the way up to their knees due to maneuvers in the snow. Soldiers trained on various ranges around camp. Training included rifles, machine guns, artillery, and there was also chemical warfare training that was done in a replica trench system that was built on Devens. In addition, Camp Devens had an Army nurses training school. You can see 2 nurses in these images. They also had a school for cooks and bakers, and they trained many smaller specialized units beyond those larger infantry divisions. The 12th Division, known as the Plymouth Division, remained at Camp Devens throughout 1918, while other divisions and units went overseas. Again, full division strength was around 20,000 or so. So this single division made up the majority of the population of Camp Devens during 1918. And as I noted here, men were from about 30, or all of the states, in the Union, but over 50% of them came from New England. So moving into August, towards the end of August, there were several sailors at Commonwealth Pier who became ill, showing symptoms of what they assumed was common influenza, but doctors quickly realized that it was something worse. Those who came down with the most severe cases succumbed very quickly, essentially drowning in their own blood. The influenza that these doctors were seeing was actually another wave making landfall in America. It is believed that the first wave happened in the spring, in March of 1918, and it was first seen at Camp Funston in Kansas. And then they believe soldiers unknowingly carried it overseas, where it perhaps mutated into a different strain, then bringing it back with them when they returned to the US. because what doctors started seeing in the fall of 1918 was far deadlier than what doctors had seen earlier in the spring. As soldiers disembarked at Commonwealth Pier, most were sent west via train to Camp Devens, or well, to Ayr, and then they would march from the train station in Ayr down to Devens, which would have been about a mile. As we move into September, I'm going to start making note of specific dates, not because one is necessarily, important, but I think it's interesting to emphasize how quickly these events at Camp Devens happened and how quickly the outbreak was over once it started. So as mentioned earlier, the first outbreak was confirmed at Camp Devens on September 8th. And within a week, there were well over 1,000 soldiers that were sick. The base hospital pictured here was on a hill in the northwest corner of camp. It consisted of 59 buildings, and some of the numbers that I've seen range, but somewhere between 1,600 to 1,800 beds available for patients, which would normally be enough for those needing hospital care due to illness or injuries. So on September 16th, again, about a week later, the base hospital reported more than 3,000 cases of Spanish flu. While not all cases were terribly serious, it was at the point where any man showing any symptoms that could be the flu were immediately sent to the hospital. 12 additional wards in the hospital were taken over to help with these patients. Interestingly, the Boston Globe reported, again, only a week after the outbreak started at Devens, that, quote, "It is understood that the epidemic has practically reached its zenith in this camp." Again, that's only a week later. A second headline from that day reads, quote, "Not alarmed over influenza," and describes that hospital staff and military personnel are concerned that exaggerated reports are going to cause panic and that the public is going to start believing that the outbreak is worse than it is. Meanwhile, however, Camp Devens has set up tents because the hospital is so overwhelmed with sick soldiers. Officials at Camp Devens assure the public that the hospital is not under quarantine, yet there were guards posted and civilians are not permitted to visit unless they have a relative who is critically ill. This photograph here comes from a scrapbook from one of the nurses at Camp Devens, and you can see right down at the bottom, she wrote epidemic tents and then nurses. You can see 2 nurses in the background. Major General Henry McCain was commanding general of the 12th Division during this time, and he was really praised throughout the papers and the reports for really doing a great job keeping the morale up of his soldiers. He was said to have spent most of his days in the hospital, actually walking the wards and speaking to the soldiers and trying to cheer them up. So, it was said that he had done a really great job kind of keeping spirits up at that point. Newspaper articles published on September 17th reiterate that there was nothing to worry about. Though with notable sarcasm, one article proclaims, quote, "Every man who shows any signs of having anything the matter with him is immediately sneaked off to the base hospital and, of course, is marked down as having Spanish influenza." During the same day, however, there was an article that said 4 funeral processions passed through the village of Ayr today, the dead man in each case being a soldier. Flags in the camp were at half-mast for half an hour in honor of the dead soldiers. Dr. John McCreary was one of the doctors on staff at the base hospital during the influenza epidemic. His family has allowed us to reproduce for the museum several of his photos and some of the pages from his journals. This is his entry from September 19th, 1918, and in it you can see he mentions there are about 300 serious cases of pneumonia and at least 10, maybe 15 deaths today. Rumors started to circulate in local towns that the death toll was higher than what was being reported to the public. On September 23rd, the Ayr Board of Health quarantined the town against Camp Devens. Soldiers found in town were rounded up and returned to the camp. However, soldiers that lived in Ayr were still able to travel freely between the two places. A statement by the camp surgeon was published, which said, though 77 deaths were reported for the 24 hours up to midnight last night, the influenza situation here appears greatly improved today. And again, this trend of unwavering optimism when describing the situation was really a theme throughout, the entire epidemic itself. And as you can see by this calendar, which is daily hospital admissions at Camp Devens from 1918, the cases were indeed dropping by the 19th of September. The Boston Globe on September 24th reported that Spanish influenza now has appeared in at least 25 Army camps in the country. However, the epidemic continues to be most severe at Camp Devens. At this point, there were over 20,000 cases total in the Army camps, and more than half of those were at Camp Devens. At this point in time, some precautions were also being publicized. One public statement came out of Camp Devens and explained that medical officers go through the barracks daily, inspecting every man. The surgeons pick out those who are not well and have them taken into the hospital, whether they wish to or not. It was also noted that doctors and nurses were wearing masks in base hospital, and visitors were required to wear masks as well. This next series of letters are written between a soldier and his wife, and they show first how communication has changed over the years, but it also has given us great insight into understanding the procedures that Camp Devens had at the time in dealing with this illness and then with the deaths that followed. So Clifford is this soldier who's stationed at Camp Devens, and his wife Lillian is in Maine. This letter is from Lillian, and if you read the beginning of it, it says, I have not got any letter from you through these weeks, 3 weeks, and am beginning to think you are sick. I hope not. And then she talks about how it seems so awful and that people are sick and dying, and that she would rather have him be home. The line that is underlined says, isn't it terrible about Chet Fletcher? Chet Fletcher was another soldier at Camp Devens who came from the same town in Maine as Clifford did. So again, she says, isn't it terrible what happened to him, on this letter dated September 25th. Lillian also writes Clifford the next day on September 26th, acknowledging that Chet's body arrived home. Chester Fletcher did indeed die at Camp Devens from influenza during the height of the epidemic on September 24th. So according to this letter, his body arrived home to Maine 2 days later on the 26th. Clifford then responds to Lillian's first letter on September 27th, it's asking, you said that it was awful about Chet Fletcher. I haven't heard anything. Is he dead? And in fact, Chet was likely buried before Clifford even realized he had died, even though they were both at Camp Devens together. Workers at the YWCA were hard at work during this time. Hundreds of relatives of the sick soldiers were descending upon air in Camp Devens, and they were finding accommodations in the area difficult. So this is the hostess house that was at Camp Devens during World War I, and they had between 75 and 100 women visitors every night during the busiest times. And these are women who were visiting because a loved one was sick in the hospital. So army cots were set up to accommodate these extra women, and representatives at the hostess house would keep in touch with the base hospital and share information with the loved ones. They even provided an automobile where they would be able to take loved ones to the hospital in case of an emergency. A headline on September 27th stated that Devens' death list reaches high mark. And indeed, that was the day where most people died at Devens. 81 soldiers died on the 27th. There were 3 Knights of Columbus buildings that Devens, that had been turned over to the Army. One was to house 150 night shift nurses. One was another dormitory used for female visitors. And a third was used as a dormitory for male relatives. There were several YMCA buildings that were also given to the Army to use during that time. Back to the Boston Globe, articles on the 29th focused on, quote, bright skies, warm sunshine, and fresh breeze as an ideal antidote for germs. All over camp, beds and bedding were being placed outside, and many soldiers actually decided to sleep outside, some in tents, some not in tents. This relieved congestion somewhat in the barracks, as it had been recommended that each man get 50 square feet of floor space to himself. So less than a month later from when the first person became sick at Camp Devens, newspaper headlines are declaring that Devens had won the war against influenza. While there were still many sick and in the hospital, deaths had slowed down quite a bit. 40 doctors and many nurses at this point left Devens and headed west to other parts of the country that were now being hit harder and where they were needed. The Globe reported that despite the fact that there is scarcely a man in camp who has not lost a friend or a relative, despite the dull days when the epidemic was raging and it took a lot of courage to smile, despite all the sadness and anxiety and worry, the morale of the men at Camp Devens stood the test. They kept at their work, and the 12th Division didn't miss a day in its training. That took what is popularly known as morale. Others call it just plain courage. On October 14th, the Air Board of Health lifted its quarantine against Camp Devens, though the camp itself was still not allowing any soldiers to leave. An article just a few days later definitively declared that military and medical authorities were going on the record to say, the Spanish influenza has been completely stamped out, and this cantonment is one of the cleanest and healthiest spots in New England. And that looks like it gets us about 5 weeks or so after that first case on September 6th, 8th. While the number of new cases slowed significantly, there were still many soldiers recuperating. One soldier writes to his mother on October 6th saying, quote, the doctor said he thought I could get up tomorrow and run around a little. It will be a week or more yet before I can go back to the barracks. His October 25th letter, more than 2 weeks later, states that he is finally out of the hospital and back with his company. He writes, quote, my lungs are pretty weak and do not seem to get well very fast, but I think I will be all right in a few days. By the time November came around, Camp Devens was feeling much more back to normal. While training for the healthy soldiers had never ceased, those affected at Devens numbered nearly 1/3 of the entire population, almost 15,000 people. The base hospital, as mentioned earlier, had somewhere between 1,600 and 1,800 available beds when the epidemic first started. But at the height of the epidemic, they were caring for 10,000 patients at one time. Since Massachusetts was the first to bear the brunt of this second wave of the Spanish flu, the states further west had some time, though not a lot, to prepare. The West Coast in particular was adamant about wearing masks in public, and the mayor of San Francisco signed a mask ordinance near the end of October, becoming the first American city to do such a thing. Like today, many people were critical of the mandate, calling masks muzzles and dirt traps. Those who chose not to wear a mask were actually fined or imprisoned. I believe they could be imprisoned for about 10 to 24 hours, up to a week or so. A third wave of the flu, which did not last as long and was not quite as deadly, peaked in December 1918 and January of 1919. Some Massachusetts communities close to Devens, for instance, Groton, continued to suspend schools. They shut down churches. There were theaters all over the place that were shut down as well. So no public gatherings during these times. When all was said and done, the Spanish flu killed approximately 675,000 Americans and at least 50 million people worldwide. Mimicking the numbers at Camp Devens, approximately 1/3 of the world's population became infected. Even with official Surgeon General records, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact number of people who died at Camp Devens as a direct result of the Spanish flu. Part of this was because how they were reported, the fact that they didn't know a lot about this virus at the time, and there were so many soldiers moving about from one place to another. Our best estimate, based on various different records, puts the death toll close to but not exceeding 1,000. The majority of those who died were from the 12th Division, as I mentioned, and they were otherwise young, healthy men. The ones who died at Devens were from the US and Canada, from 30 states and 107 towns in Massachusetts. Exhibits in our museum honor the soldiers, as well as 2 doctors, 5 nurses, and 1 chaplain who died while caring for patients at Camp Devens. William Robinson, again of the Globe, immortalized them in print by writing, quote, "They died the death of a soldier. They stuck to their posts until the end without a thought of themselves and with only their duty in mind." As we saw with a couple of the letters we looked at, some of the procedure at Camp Devens during this time is able to be understood. As soon as a soldier was considered gravely ill, a telegram was sent to the family. A telegram was also sent, of course, if death happened. In some cases, the bodies were sent home within days, as we saw from that last letter. Others did not go home right away. Stories were passed down that people remember seeing pine coffins stacked up by the railroad, waiting specifically for influenza cars to take them away. This is a picture of a temporary wooden cross that's in our museum currently, and it remains a bit of a mystery. It is for Herbert O. Gilman, who died at Camp Devens of influenza on September 27th. And you may remember September 27th was that day that lost the most soldiers at one time. The cross's very existence makes us wonder if Camp Devens did temporarily bury bodies while they awaited arrangements, just as the Army did overseas when dealing with mass casualties. The morgue at the base hospital was documented as being quite inadequate at this time, based on the numbers that were dying, and they had to turn other barracks into makeshift morgues. Gilman was eventually buried in Attleboro, where he is today, and it's possible that interment records from that city can give us more information on this. Camp Devens did not have its own cemetery during this time, so those who died during the epidemic, who had no next of kin, were buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in Ayr in the soldiers' lot. There are actually approximately 50 soldiers buried there, the vast majority of them having died at Devens during the pandemic. In the spring of 2019, the Fort Devens Museum dedicated a monument on Devens to honor those who died during those devastating months. Dr. McCreary, who I mentioned earlier, wrote that the unsung heroes of World War I were those who worked amidst the sick and the dying, particularly those without specific medical training. He wrote, quote, "They hadn't entered the Army for such work, and with the terrible fear of the flu, which was in every heart, it took a particular brand of courage for them to even go near to the hospital. Their courage ranks with any which was shown on the battlefield." And thank you. So that marks the end of that portion. I just want to take a minute to mention, for those of you who are not familiar with the Fort Devens Museum, we are currently open to the public, although of course we have specific procedures in place as far as how many people we can have in and masks as well. But we are open on Tuesdays and Fridays, as well as the third Saturday of each month, from 10 until 3. So come by and see us. We happy to show you around the museum. We have some great tour guides who can help out. We also have many resources for those doing research. We have newspapers, photographs, yearbooks, diaries, unit histories, and a fairly extensive archive. And then as far as getting involved and supporting the museum, again, visiting us is great. We much appreciate donations as we are a private nonprofit museum. We love having new members, so please consider signing up for a membership. Other ways to get involved or share your story. If you have connection to Fort Devens, you were here, you know someone who was, if you grew up on Devens, if you worked on Devens, any of those stories that are related, really help us with this story. And of course, I would say tell your friends too. Our community really is spread out all across the country and even beyond that. So we're always looking for new friends. So tell a friend. And with that, I thank you.
All right, thank you, Kara. We do have a couple of questions here. Let's see, the first one is, could there be any Devens alums still alive and able to offer their accounts of that time period?
Well, I guess not alive who would have been involved then, but we have spoken to people like descendants of soldiers who were at Devens during that time. In fact, we had a visitor whose great grandfather or something was at Devens. He actually died of influenza 2 days, I believe it was, after leaving Devens. I don't know the exact date, so I don't know if it was at the height of it, because again, I think they were sort of quarantining. But that again goes to show how hard it is to sort of get a handle on how many people died there, because clearly, he died so quickly that he was likely infected at Camp Devens, and then went home and ended up dying there. So that's about the best we can do is, people, descendants of people who were there who have either stories handed down or again, letters, diaries, that kind of thing.
Okay. And then someone asks about whether it spread to the surrounding towns.
Well, again, I would say no, it doesn't seem to have really, based on my research that was done in Groton, which obviously is in close proximity. And Doug, you mentioned in Harvard that there didn't seem to be a whole lot that was spreading there. I have not checked air out specifically. I read in one of the reports, one of the medical journals that I used as a resource, that said that part of the reason that this happened so quickly at Devens was because they sort of weren't concerned with quarantining. It happened so fast that they were just kind of trying to get through the day. And so they sort of didn't quarantine, which meant that it didn't have time to kind of spread slowly. It's like, people either got infected and then developed, the antibodies, or they got sick and got well. When I looked at the records in Groton, I mean, there were so few people that were sick and died during that time. And again, some of the towns had quarantined themselves against it. And were shutting down their programs. So as best I can tell from just the few towns that I've looked at around there, spreading from Camp Devens didn't seem to be a huge thing between Devens and the civilian community.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, when I researched Harvard, there were very few, I think only about 3 to 5 people who died in Harvard. And at least one of them actually came from another town and came here to be nursed and died. So they caught it elsewhere and came to Harvard. And then when I was looking through the Turner Public Spirit, I did find that there were 4 or 5 people who caught it but survived. Now those are just the ones that were reported, so the numbers were probably a little bit higher, but overall there wasn't a great number of them.
Yeah, and as best as I can tell from the records that I've looked at, it looks to me like most of the soldiers who died at Devens died very quickly after having symptoms. I would say within a few days. Whereas, those who kind of lingered and had it for a long time are the ones that eventually got well again. And again, that's kind of why you see that sort of, that big spike in the middle, in the middle of the month there. It's, people who were showing certain symptoms right off the bat were very likely to die within a few days.
And then another question, someone asks, someone asked where the Devens Museum is located.
We are at 94 Jackson Road, which if you're familiar with Devens, that's the road that goes pretty much straight through it at this point, connects to Route 2, and then goes out the main gate, which is West Main Street in Air. We are in a 3-story brick old barracks building, right across the road from Grant Road. So it's kind of big, blocky, 3 stories. And we're on the 3rd floor there, but we do have elevator access.
Okay. And then someone else asked what the connection of the YMCA to Devens was.
Well, again, the YMCA had a presence, in all of those army camps at the time. It was sort of a big service organization. They really kind of worked on sort of several different things. I mean, part of it was like a morale boosting thing. They would set up, theater shows and things like that. There was also an element of keeping the camps clean, so they would hand out all this literature and pamphlets on, how to stay healthy and, how to be moral and things like that. So again, it was sort of just expected that it would be there as, kind of a big presence. And as I mentioned, they had, 14 buildings ultimately that they ran there. But so again, I would say it was sort of for morale purposes as well as, trying to keep it clean.
Okay. And do you know where the hospital at that time was? Is it where the hospital is now? Or
no, the hospital is vaguely on Jackson Road, where Mount Wachusett Community College is, if anyone's familiar with that. It's heading closer. If you go in the main gate and head on Jackson Road, it's actually past our museum and heading towards Route 2.
Okay. Let's see. I think that's it. Yeah, that seems to be it.
Okay, and you know what I didn't mention, and a lot of people may know this now, but one question that comes up a lot is why was it called the Spanish flu? And I've read a lot of kind of bizarre thoughts online about that. The one that I think is the most widely accepted and makes the most sense is that they started calling it that because Spain was neutral during World War I, so that in a lot of their publications and their newspapers, they weren't reporting necessarily on what was going on in the war. They were reporting on the epidemic and what was happening there, as opposed to other countries who were reporting more on, what their troops were doing, kind of keep up morale. Again, let's not talk about, the bad thing that's wiping out everyone, at home, that sort of thing. So that's where that comes from. It has nothing to do with it originating in Spain or anything.
Okay, and someone did just actually squeeze in another question here. Where is the memorial located?
The memorial is pretty close to, I think they call it like, I don't know if it's War Memorial Park there. It's sort of by the flagpole and the parade ground, where they have a lot of the other memorials. It's on, as you saw the picture, it's on kind of a natural boulder, and it's pretty close to Sherman Ave, which goes right by the parade ground. It's pretty close to the sidewalk there.
Okay, all right. And I think that is it.
That's it.
That is all I see. Yes.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kara. And it was great presentation. For those of you who are interested in perhaps seeing it again, and again and again and again, we encourage you to watch it many times. It should be available on YouTube, as well as on our website, harvardhistory.org. Within the next week. Shouldn't take that long for me to get it up, but it won't take very long. And was there anything else? No, I think we are all set.
All right, well, I thank you. I appreciate you having me. And I would say if anyone thinks of any other questions that they might have, or they can't get to sleep because they're, dying that they wish they had asked this question, feel free to just email us or call or come by, and we can help you out.
Yeah, feel free to email us at curator@harvardhistory.org, and we can pass it along to Kara. And any questions you might have. I think we're all set.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kara.